All right. So we're going to try to finish what we started to try to finish last week and that we didn't quite get done. We are looking at end time prophecies and stuff in the news. And as things come our direction, we're trying to see how the scripture applies to them. Last week we looked at Romans chapter 1 and saw the downward spiral. When you begin to not give God his place, you will begin to get into sin. And when you begin to get into sin, if you don't get that checked, that will turn from natural sin into unnatural sin. And ultimately, Romans 1 says that God will give you over to a reprobate mind. Basically, that's a mind that is calloused over and can no longer feel anything spiritual. You could say they are unsalvageable. Now, I don't know when a person's reached that point, and it's not my job to do that. So I witness to everything that moves. But Romans chapter 1 says you can reach a point after which you can no longer be saved. And that's a very serious thing. So we looked at that last week. And this week we're going to begin to look at what I called the canary in the coal mine. So y'all remember your history about how they used to do coal mines. I've never personally experienced it myself. But in Matthew chapter 24, we begin to get an idea of what Jesus says was the canary in the coal mine. Beginning in verse 32, he gave a parable. And the parable involves a fig tree, and that's Israel. All over the Bible, that's where the illustration has its residence, is in the nation of Israel. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, you know that summer is nigh. Now, so that's coming out of a period of dormant, right? So when it comes out of a period of dormant, it buds, it gives forth leaves. That's what Jesus is illustrating. You know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. So Jesus gives this parable about how you can tell, the canary in the coal mine, how you can tell when things are changing. And prophetically, when they're coming to the end in this case. So the signs of the end times, they are many, but when you just want to look at the big ones, the nation of Israel coming to be a nation again is probably the biggest one we'll ever see. And because that's been true all of our lives, I think we take it for granted. But think about what that was. Jesus predicted that Jerusalem would be leveled, that the temple would be destroyed, that the people would be cast out of the land, and literally, according to the prophets in the Old Testament, they would be hidden among the nations. Now that's an odd thing to say. So if you destroy a bunch of people and you just make them refugees and scatter them out, you assume they will cease to be anything. They will just be absorbed into the world and they'll stop. But not with the Jews. The Jews have remained to be a people, though they were cast out, hidden among the nations, scattered among the nations, it says. For them now to come back is a fulfillment of the prophecy. Jesus says when the fig tree puts forth her leaves. Israel in 1948 became a nation. And I don't know whether there's ever been a nation in the world, not that I know of, that ever became a nation after 2,000 years of not being a nation. Being scattered among the nations of the world and then coming back. It's been beautiful to watch. It's been amazing. You know, and some of it was rather painful to read the history that when the Jews were coming out of Europe, looking for a place to land, looking for a place to be, man, the United States did not give them safe haven. That's embarrassing. I feel terrible about that every time I think about it. But they did find a place. Ultimately, they wound up in Israel, what we know as Israel today. And that was actually the dividing up of things that they did at the end of World War they gave that to them as an area. So this is the parable of the fig tree, and it is the canary in the coal mine. So have you ever seen that? Here's an old picture of that. The canary, they would take it in a cage into the coal mine. You know how it worked? When that canary would fall over and faint, they knew they had to get out because they were in danger of an explosion or lack of oxygen or both. This I found exceedingly interesting. This is an actual one, and so they would have the hole there on the right side where they would put the canary in, and then there's the viewing on both sides. And somebody, I would suppose, that was their job, to keep their eye on that canary. And when the canary would begin to get a little woozy and would begin to faint, on top there's an oxygen bottle. Now it's just air, but they had it compressed air, and they would start pumping that, and they'd be able to revive that canary. Now, the thing about that gets me is that they cared about the canary. Don't you find that fascinating that, they cared that much about in fact, I've read that some of the miners actually got, like the canary was a pet, and they really loved it like we love our pets. And that's the reason why they didn't want the canary to die, and so they would give it oxygen when it needed to. All right, I just thought that was interesting.
They're hard to catch.
Huh?
They're hard to catch.
They're hard to catch. Well, when they're inside there, they're not going anywhere. What a life. Well, so current events feed into this canary in the coal mine. So what I mean by all that is literally this. If you want to know about how things are going prophetically, when are we getting close to the end? Jesus said, watch Israel. So Israel is back in the nation, and they've been in turmoil ever since. But what's going on right now, and we've talked about this in the past, there's actually a couple of wars that are coming. A couple of big wars. Ezekiel 38 and 39 is the big dog. It's the big war. And it is, there's a certain grouping of nations that Ezekiel said would be gathered. And so the king of the north, Gog and Magog, and it's going to be Iran and Turkey and Russia, right? God's going to put a hook in Russia's jaw and bring them down. And they're going to try to take a spoil of Israel. And right when Israel's about to be overwhelmed and overrun and all hope is lost, God's going to do a destruction like no army probably has ever been destroyed, according to Ezekiel 38 and 39, 37, 38, 39. But there's also Psalm 83. Now, Psalm 83 is kind of an overlooked war. People didn't pay much attention to it until these latter days, when people have been paying more attention to what's it going to be like. And so, Psalm 83, let's look at that, and you'll find it fascinating. Psalm 83 is a psalm of crying out to God because of what their enemies are getting ready to do. It's a description of what we see shaping up. You'll see it as we read it. Psalm 83:1. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult. I'd say 2,000 or 3,000 rockets. Fits the criteria of a tumult. And they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people. Right? Since the last war, Hamas and all the rest of the terrorist group, they've been making plans. And as I mentioned Sunday night, who paid for those rockets? You ought to be proud of your government.
Yeah.
Your government sent that money to Iran. Crates of it, stacks of it. And they used it for terror purposes. I have no doubt that many of those rockets were bought with that money that we sent over there. They've taken counsel, crafty counsel, against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation. Who does that sound like? Yeah. Sounds like every day in Iran when you listen to their leaders. Yeah. Every single day. Every time they have an opportunity. They want to drive Israel into the sea. That was what they came up with. That was a saying that they came up with many years ago. We're going to drive Israel into the sea. Let us cut off them out of being a nation, that the name of Israel be no more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. The tabernacles of Edom. I wish I had the time to go into it. So Edom isn't a nation in this scenario. It's a bunch of people living in tents. Now, who does that sound like? That sounds like the Palestinians. Now, they're living in cities now, but they started out in tents. Remember the tent cities? That was the Palestinians. And they're not a whole lot more than that now. I mean, think about what these people have allowed to happen. They have allowed Hamas to be popular. In fact, Hamas was thinking, as we saw Sunday night, that they would win the election. And so the Palestinians have allowed Hamas to be popular. And yet Hamas sending rockets into Israel has resulted in buildings being blown up. People's lives being destroyed, literally. So here's the Confederate group. The tabernacles of Edom, the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarines, Gebal, and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. That's Lebanon up north. Asser, that's Assyria. And Assyria basically right now is Iran and part of Iraq and Syria. Asser also is joined with them. That's kind of interesting. They've joined with them, but it's kind of after the fashion. It's kind of behind the scenes the way I read it, which is exactly what Iran does in funding this turmoil. They have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. Now, Selah has been theorized to mean a lot of different things. Whatever else it probably means, it means, now stop and think about that. It might have been a musical interlude, but the point was, stop and think about what I just said. Do unto them as unto the Midianites. And God goes on, or the writers go on, and they're begging God to do this to the enemies. So there's a phone call that has come out between the Israeli defense people. You know how Israel does it? Before they bring a building down, they call them and say, this building is coming down, you need to get out. Giving them ample. Whoever fought a war like that? I mean, this is the second mile of compassion, maybe third and fourth mile of compassion. But there's this phone call. This IDF person calls and tells them to get out. So, where will it begin? Well, I'll just read what it says. A short but shocking phone call between the IDF and a Palestinian in Gaza reveals the entire conflict in a nutshell. This is what Ben Shapiro said. In the recording, the IDF is attempting to warn about the impending strike, pleading with the man to evacuate the building before the bombing because civilians are present. See if I can make that a little bigger. Palestinian says, I can't get all the people out. I need at least 2 hours to get them out. Listen, we're going to bomb the building. The member of the IDF replies. You want to bomb? Bomb whatever you want, the man responds. No, brother, we need to do everything we can so you don't die, the IDF member says. We want to die, the Palestinian answers. By the way, there's a recording. I could play you the recording, but it's in their language, so it wouldn't do any good. But you have a responsibility for children's lives, the Israeli pushes back. If the children need to die, then they'll die, the Palestinian counters. God forbid, God forbid. What do you want to die? The soldier asks. This is how we reveal your cruelty, the man responds. So when you read Psalm 83 and you hear things like that, the conclusion I come to is these people are insane.
Yeah.
There's not an insanity, there is a demonic layer to this.
Absolutely.
Steve?
I was just saying that Biden sitting there calling for a ceasefire. Come on.
Yeah.
Good grief.
And my response, if I were Bibi, I will if they will.
I'd tell him, I'd say, when I get the job done.
Yeah. And that's what he told me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's what they should do.
So think back to our study of the unseen realm. Michael Heiser brought out very well how in the Old Testament, God intended for these not Nephilim, Elohim, thank you. Something's wrong with my brain now. These glasses are messing me up. The Elohim, which are beings that live in that realm. All the beings that live in the spiritual realm are Elohim. And he brought it out how they were expected to be over certain areas, and they rebelled. Genesis 3, we know about Satan and that rebellion. We know about Genesis 6 and that rebellion. We know about Genesis 9 and 10, the Tower of Babel and that rebellion. Well, so he brought out that they were given geographical areas that they were supposed to rule over. Well, they rebelled. And it seems, and I've showed you the overlay of what they call the occupied territory in Israel, is actually these areas where Israel did not kill or drive out all that they were told to.
Yeah.
Here's my point. There seems to be a geographic nature to this demonic activity. I don't pretend to understand all of it. I'm just saying this is what the Bible says, and this is what we see, and I believe the Palestinian situation makes it very clear. There's a website. If you want to look it up and research a little bit, the website is trackingbibleprophecy.org. Trackingbibleprophecy.org. So they go through and they take the nations as they're listed in the Bible and research where they belong today. So here we have a picture of the Confederate nations against Israel, Psalm 83. Remember these two battles. The first one, Psalm 83, is going to be the close ring around Israel. The Ezekiel 37, 38, 39 war is going to be the farther out ring, Turkey, Iran, Russia. So here we see the Confederacy. Here's where I am in this. Right now, it's just the Palestinians, backed by Iran. This will spin out of control. I'll make a prophecy based on what I see in the Bible. This will spin out of control when these other nations confederate with the Palestinians. Now, at this point, they're not. And you can thank Donald Trump for that. Donald Trump got several of these nations to make an agreement with Israel, basically an agreement they can exist. That's a big deal. That's a big move in the right direction, which Biden has begun to undo. As I said Sunday night, someone said, when the Democrats are in power, the Middle East burns. That's what we're seeing take place. If Israel does something that so incenses the Islamic world, these other confederate nations may come on board with the thing. That's what it will look like when it spins out of control. Walter, and then Sue.
What do you make of the Lebanese sending rockets into Israel?
Well, as Amir said Sunday night, it may be just they got to do something. They're not really serious about it. They're doing something so they can say we did something. It could be the beginning of them. They're a part of this conspiracy. Tyre is in Lebanon. Sue?
I was listening to Amir today, and he said that Lebanon is firing on them now.
Is what?
Lebanon is firing on them now.
Right. Yeah, that's what Walter was bringing out. And so Sunday night, that was what Amir said, was that Lebanon may be doing it just for show, to say we tried to help our brothers. Or it could be there's going to be a bigger thing begin to come on.
Something's happened. She's got hurt.
Uh-huh.
She's got hurt. She doesn't normally
No.
cry like that.
So we could go into a lot of detail here. I'll let you do that on your own because we got much more to talk about tonight. So there's these two wars to watch, and Psalm 83 war is something that was really only discovered in the Word, I don't know, 15 years ago or something like that. There was actually a Bible, I think it was in Ireland in a bog or something. It was an ancient one that was discovered, and there were many other documents, but they were not salvageable. But this one was open to Psalm 83. It's just interesting. Okay. So Luke 21 and verse 20 talks about this same thing of the canary in the coal mine. Luke 21 and verse 20. Luke 21, 20 to 24. And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. Then let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let them not that are in the countries enter thereinto. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck, in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land, wrath upon this people. And they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Okay, that has a broad aspect. That happened in 70 A.D., but the conclusion of that is only just now happening because Israel stopped being a nation, and after 2,000 years, now as they've come back, and this prophecy can continue to be fulfilled. So, while I can't tell you that the rapture is going to happen tomorrow, I can tell you I hope the rapture happens tomorrow. I can tell you it's a day closer today than it was yesterday. And anybody who sets a day or an hour much more than that should be very careful, because we don't know. Even what we see going on in the Middle East could continue for several years. Doesn't look to me like it's feasible that will happen, but it could. So don't get your rapture robes out just yet. But I believe that as the pilot often tells the people behind him, we are on approach to the airport. So we see a recurring template that happens over and over, not only in Scripture, but we see this happen in history as well. The template of anti-Semitism. It begins to be a growing persecution, and then finally God has to intervene. Now, how did God intervene with the 6 billion Jews that Hitler was killing? He didn't do it with his supernatural power. He did it with the United States.
Yeah.
Had it not been for the United States, there'd be no Jews today. Now, maybe that's not the way to say it. If God hadn't empowered us to be able to be the great nation that could stand against that kind of evil, Israel wouldn't exist today.
Right.
God used us to go against that anti-Semitism. And that's how many times has that played out that we know of in the Bible? We've got Joseph. He was persecuted, thrown in jail, and he wound up second to the king, right? Israel in Egypt. There rose up over king over Egypt who knew not Joseph, and they became slaves. And God extricated them supernaturally. Esther, same story, different names. And then I mentioned the World War II Holocaust. Any thoughts before we move on? All right. In Joel 3, 1 and 2, there is a final gathering of storm clouds. You can read that. Our time is fleeting, so I'll let you read that on your own. Joel chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, Israel will become a cup of trembling to the nations. So all the current events that we see right now playing out, and really, am I making a false observation that all of last year and into this year, something's different?
Absolutely.
Now, not just COVID. I'm not just COVID's a compartment within that, but prophetically, things are shaping up in ways that it's just different.
Yep.
And I believe it's moving towards that time. So I mentioned last week that a guy wrote an article, and he has looked at the history of the United States. It's probably broader than that, where a people go through a period of time and they go through a cycle where they ultimately come to a place of a moral convulsion. And in his article, he says that's what got Trump elected. Well, I don't agree. It was in the Atlantic, so it's suspect. And I don't agree with all of his conclusions. But he is right. Trump got elected. And so Trump got elected because nobody was listening. Since the 1960s, we have been engaged in a civil war. Started out amiable, nice enough, trying to pass laws, trying to elect people to get something changed. We had the Supreme Court do the things that they did back in the 60s. School prayer was out, abortion was in, all those kind of things. And someone's made the observation that since a nation doesn't have a soul, that God's judgment begins immediately as soon as a nation does these things. We have been under the judgment of God ever since then. It has ratcheted up with every election cycle, and it's gotten more shrill until finally, and I'm not, so violence is not the answer at this point for anybody who's listening. But what happened in January after the election, all those people that went to the Capitol, it was because those people really, I'm not saying they did right. I'm saying they did that because nobody was listening. And we're at that flashpoint of this moral convulsion this guy goes into. His name is David Brooks, if you want to look up his article in the Atlantic. It's really pretty interesting. But we don't have time to go further in that. So, we'll have to leave it there.